I'm a very bad actor, as has been kindly pointed out by Charles Moore and many others. But thank you all for coming on behalf of all of us speaking today. I'm just going to talk for a little while about the last book I've done, The Making of Modern Britain, which describes Britain between 1900 and the end of the Second World War, an unimaginably different place, of course, where we treated the leader of the Liberal Democrats with respect and interest. Where the quickest way of getting to America was by boat. And where you could hear bird song in Richmond Park. So, but more seriously, of course, people always ask from time to time, is it really worth spending time looking back at the history of this country, the first half of the 20th century? And I suppose the main thing that I'd like to talk about today is just the extraordinary power of some of the parallels that struck me when I was making programmes and writing the book, which always comes first. We talked today, we've had a lot in our politics recently about political sleaze and politicians on the take and all the rest of it. And I have to say, when I was researching British politics at the end of the First World War and into the 20s, I thought, these guys now, they know nothing. You want to see sleaze at an industrial level, go back to Lloyd George. Sorry, Nick Clegg, but go back to the last Liberal leader in power. Not only was he in the business of selling honours and peerages on a tariff, including to convicted criminals. The man he chose as his go-between was, to my mind, one of the most extraordinary figures in the entire history of British politics, a man called Oldie Gregory. As in the money, he'd been a spy, he'd been all sorts of things. And he actually set up, not very far from here, at the bottom of Whitehall, his own offices, and he published his own newspaper, which was designed to appear like an official government publication on thick, creamy white paper, full of boring announcements and so on. And he dressed his retainers in this office in Whitehall in uniforms which appeared to be government ones, with kind of the crown on the buttons and all the rest of it. And most people thought he was a senior member of the government. Slightly obscure, nobody quite knew what he did, but he went around and he was a guy who was buying and selling. He was also the great clearinghouse for all the scuttlebutt and gossip, and was almost certainly involved in a series of not only quite impressive frauds, but also blackmail going on. But that was as nothing to the fact that, having researched this guy reasonably carefully, I'm pretty sure that he not only murdered his mistress when he got bored with her, and buried her on an island on the Thames, but he also almost certainly either caused to disappear or murdered the journalist who was on his tail, a former Labour MP who was on his tail. He was an extraordinary figure. He was eventually caught when they brought in the Prevention of Abuses Honours Act in about 1925, as I recall. He was caught shortly after that in a sting operation, and said that he wanted to go to trial, and that when he was on trial he would delight in revealing the names of the senior politicians and members of both houses with whom he had been dealing, and his tariff and the way he operated, and the chief whips of the various parties, because there were three-party politics in those days, that's the other thing, three-party politics for a while, got together, and he said very little in the witness box. A guilty verdict was served. He only served, I think, 6 months in prison, and then he was sent abroad on a rather generous pension to Paris. The pension was paid for by the political parties to shut him up. And a wonderful final piece of Oldie Gregory cheek. After this deal had first been thrashed out, when he was facing extremely serious charges, he said he was prepared to accept it, but the pension had to be doubled. And the parties went back and doubled the pension. But just so we all remember that you can be a rogue and also, at another level, a relatively fine human being. There's a coda to the story. In 1940, when the Germans invaded Paris, they rounded up Maundy Gregory, and they knew all about his past. He'd been close to Churchill, and he'd been close to Lloyd George as well, of course, and most of the British politicians. And they wanted to use him as a kind of Lord Haw-Haw figure, a propaganda figure. And by then he was old and broke, and all the years of bad living had caught up with him. And he absolutely refused. And he died in a concentration camp as a result, at Drumsey. So you never quite know. The story of people's lives are over until it's over. And another of the great parallels that I've been obsessed by, of course, is the financial crash. Because that's one of the few examples, I think, where politicians have actually learned a bit from history. If you look at what happened in the late 1920s, a booming American stock market, not just based on a bubble, but based on real things, just like this one was based on e-commerce and all the rest of it. In those days it was based on washing machines and the first cars rolling off. Booming American stock market, above all fueled by a property boom. The property boom was fueled by some pretty impressive crooks. When Bernard Madoff was sent down, you may remember people said, "Oh, Madoff, he was responsible for a Ponzi scheme." Well, the original Ponzi was an Italian immigrant who was flogging off plots of building land in Florida to innocent fools in New York and Chicago, persuading them it was about to be a massive boom and everyone's going to move to Florida for the sun. Some of those plots, many of those plots were far too small to build a house on, and quite a few of them were actually underwater. And he indeed did go to jug, where he was rescued by Mussolini, interestingly. But they didn't have hedge funds, of course, in those days, but they did have the exciting new investment trusts working in pyramids of connected investments, very much like some of the dodgy financial arrangements of the last few years. Almost everything, right up to the boom itself, was very like what happened this time round. Same sorts of characters, bankers so impressive and mysterious that mere politicians quailed and didn't ask them the questions they ought to have been. And not only politicians. One of the best bits of this is John Maynard Keynes, great economist, spotted what was going on, spotted this boom could not last. And apart from being an economist, he also had his own investment trust. And so he went over to America, went over to America, sold all his American stocks, came back triumphant. And the boom went on, and a couple of weeks later he panicked and bought back into the market just before it went pop. Even John Maynard Keynes. But the reason I say that politicians learned from that is, of course, what turned the crash into a worldwide recession and produced the terrible economic and then political consequences that followed, was that the various governments and central banks didn't get together. They came to a conference in London, didn't agree anything, and we had trade barriers going back up again, and the trade war and the depression that followed. And this time around, I think it's fair to say that actually politicians had read their Keynes and had read their J.K. Galbraith, and at least that part of the story thus far has been avoided. Of course, this was also the period when we had hung parliaments. We had the short-lived 1924 Labour government, and there's not much to learn because politics was so different, except that we did seem to have, probably do still seem to have, a two-party system deep down, which means that if the Liberals rise, it can only be probably at the Labour Party's expense, paying them back for what happened in the 1920s. Sorry, Pauline, for that.